James Harrison's champagne slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor, because the millionaire's aunt had just declared, before 200 stunned guests, that he and her niece would make beautiful babies. The crystal chandeliers of Sterling Manor glittered like captured stars, scattering their brilliance across marble floors polished to a mirror's shine. The annual charity gala was the crown jewel of the city's social calendar, a place where millionaires paraded their influence and whispered promises that might later shape legislation or buy loyalty. Yet for Victoria Sterling, it was a cage lined in silk. She adjusted her emerald silk gown with practiced grace, her poise immaculate, her smile calculated. The youngest CEO of Sterling Technologies, she had mastered the art of appearing untouchable, the perfect blend of elegance and authority. But behind her green eyes, shining beneath expertly lined lashes, there was a shadow, a quiet weariness that came from too many years spent proving herself worthy of an empire she had never asked to inherit. Tonight, like every gala before it, she played her role flawlessly, all while wondering if anyone truly saw her beyond the title. Across the room, James Harrison gripped his champagne flute with hands that looked out of place on such fragile crystal. His calloused fingers were used to checking IV drips, smoothing wrinkled sheets, comforting trembling children in hospital beds. The tuxedo, borrowed and a little snug across his broad shoulders, made him feel like an imposter among the glittering crowd. He had no business in this hall of oil paintings and priceless jewels, no business brushing shoulders with people who measured their worth in stock portfolios rather than lives touched. Yet he was here, compelled by duty, his supervisor insisting the medical staff show support for the hospital's benefactor. His Darar Kai scanned the room, catching on conversations about mergers and tax shelters, and he fought the urge to retreat. The only thing that steadied him was the thought of the children, his patients, whose futures had been brightened by the generosity of the Sterling family. For them, he could endure the charade. Then there was Margaret. At 72, Margaret Sterling glided through the ballroom like a velvet hurricane, her silver hair sculpted into perfection, her sapphire necklace catching the light with every grand gesture. Age had not dulled her appetite for mischief. If anything, it had sharpened it. Her eyes, keen, predatory, and alive with amusement, searched the crowd for opportunities to stir. She had always been larger than life, the kind of woman who turned whispers into roars with a single well-placed remark. Tonight, however, her attention was fixed with laser precision. She had watched her niece glide through conversations with diplomats and donors, her smile as polished as the marble beneath their feet, and Margaret had sighed. What use was power without passion? And then she had seen James Harrison standing alone, awkward and handsome in equal measure, his discomfort written on his face, but his sincerity radiating like a beacon. Margaret's lips curved. Yes, this was the one. "James," she declared, materializing at his side like an elegant storm breaking. He nearly spilled his champagne, startled by the sudden presence of the woman who had personally built an entire hospital wing with her fortune. "Mrs. Sterling," he stammered, "thank you again for inviting—" "Margaret," she corrected firmly, looping her arm through his with surprising strength. "And I found someone you must meet. No arguments." Before James could protest, he was swept across the ballroom in her wake, dodging waiters with trays of caviar and curious gazes that followed Margaret wherever she went. His pulse quickened when he saw who awaited them. Victoria Sterling, poised beneath the chandeliers, her emerald gown gleaming like envy itself. She turned at Margaret's approach, and for a fleeting second, her mask slipped. Her eyes widened, softening as they landed on him, as though she'd been waiting without knowing it. "Victoria, darling," Margaret purred, positioning them like chess pieces. "This is James Harrison, one of the finest nurses at Sterling Children's Hospital. James, my niece. Though she's far too busy running her empire to notice there are other things in life besides quarterly reports." James extended his hand. Victoria's fingers slipped into his, warm and confident, and the spark between them was instantaneous, startling. Electricity hummed through the touch, subtle but undeniable. He looked into her eyes and found not the intimidating executive he'd imagined, but a woman with a quiet hunger for something real. She, in turn, saw not just a nurse but a man of substance, with scars on his hands that spoke of compassion forged through service. Before either could process it, Margaret stepped forward, her mischief reaching its crescendo. She clapped her hands sharply, signaling to the orchestra. The violins faltered, the room's chatter stilled, and all attention swung toward her as though the universe itself were in on her scheme. Margaret's voice carried like velvet wrapped around steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, forgive the interruption. Tonight is about generosity, about building futures, and sometimes the greatest gift is right in front of us." Her eyes sparkled wickedly. I am delighted to inform you that my niece Victoria and the remarkable James Harrison would make the most beautiful babies." The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to vibrate. A single champagne glass slipped from James's numb fingers, shattering against marble in a crash that echoed like a gunshot. Victoria's face burned to the exact shade of her gown, her knuckles whitening around her glass. Phones lifted discreetly around the room, flashes of light signaling social media already feeding on the scandal. One outrageous sentence had detonated like a bomb in the middle of Sterling Manor, and nothing would ever be the same again. The limousine curved up the mountain road like a sleek black arrow cutting through the night, its headlights scattering shadows between towering pines. Inside, the silence was heavier than the leather seats. Victoria Sterling sat with her legs crossed, the cream-colored slacks and cashmere sweater she had chosen for the weekend, doing little to ease the knot in her stomach. She tried to focus on the snow-dusted peaks looming in the distance, but every time she shifted her gaze, it landed on the man across from her. James Harrison, the nurse her aunt had chosen to humiliate her with in front of 200 guests. He was no longer bound in his too-tight tuxedo, but wore dark jeans and a navy pullover that clung to the breadth of his shoulders. Casual, comfortable, and yet every inch of him radiated the same quiet strength she'd glimpsed that night when his hand had closed around hers. "I still can't believe we're doing this," she said finally, breaking the long silence. James's mouth twitched, halfway to a smile. "Your aunt is very persuasive. When she called the hospital this morning, she managed to convince my supervisor to give me time off and even rearranged coverage for my shifts." He shook his head in disbelief. "I think she might have hypnotized him." Victoria exhaled, somewhere between a laugh and a groan. "That sounds exactly like Margaret. She could talk a stone into bleeding if she thought it would help her win a bet." Her tone softened despite herself. "But I should warn you, she doesn't play fair. If we're here, it means she has an entire week and of traps laid out." The car crested a final curve and Moonridge Resort appeared like something from a snow globe. Timber and stone buildings stood warm against the icy peaks, windows glowing with golden light, smoke rising from enormous fireplaces. Fairy lights draped across wraparound porches shimmered like constellations. The place looked enchanted, designed to disarm defenses the moment one stepped inside. The concierge was waiting, smiling knowingly. "Welcome, Mr. Harrison, Ms. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling has arranged everything. Adjacent suites, mountain views, and tomorrow's itinerary, hiking, a couple's spa treatment, and a private dinner by the lake at sunset." Victoria's face went hot. "Couple's spa?" The concierge beamed, oblivious. "Yes, she said you both needed relaxation." In her suite, Victoria paced the wide, luxurious room, past the stone fireplace and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a valley dusted in snow. Under normal circumstances, she might have delighted in the view, the hush of mountains reminding her there was life outside boardrooms. Tonight, she felt trapped inside her aunt's elaborate theater. A knock at the adjoining door startled her. "Victoria?" James's voice carried through, steady but hesitant. "I thought maybe we should talk about this situation." She opened the door to find him leaning on the frame, his dark hair mussed as though he'd been running his hands through it. There was something disarming in his casual posture, in the honesty of his eyes. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "I was just trying to decide if I could sue Margaret for emotional distress via unwanted matchmaking." James chuckled, and the sound unraveled a knot in her chest. He took the armchair opposite hers by the fire, his long frame folding easily into it. "I don't think it would hold up in court," he said. "Besides, I don't think she means harm. She's just unconventional." "Unconventional?" Victoria repeated, arching a brow. "She announced to half the city that we'd make beautiful babies." His ears flushed pink, but his voice remained steady. "Embarrassing, yes. But for what it's worth, I wasn't offended. Just surprised." He paused, then added almost reluctantly, "She isn't wrong about the attraction part." The words landed like a spark. Victoria blinked, thrown off balance by his candor. He looked equally startled by his own admission, shifting as though he wished he could pull the words back. But the air between them changed, charged with something unspoken. James filled the silence, voice low. "I noticed you the moment you spoke at the hospital fundraiser last month. You gave a speech about pediatric cancer research, and He exhaled, shaking his head. "I actually cried. I tried to hide it, but you were unforgettable." Her throat tightened. She had no idea he'd been there. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you're Victoria Sterling," he said simply, "and I'm just a nurse." "Not just anything," she countered fiercely. "You're the one they call the angel nurse. Do you know that? The kids light up when you walk down the hall." His eyes widened, softened. They sat in silence, the firelight painting their faces in amber and shadow, the walls of Margaret's scheme slowly dissolving into something dangerously real. Victoria folded her arms as though to steady herself. So what do we do? Pretend to go along with her games? James's lips curved, slow and deliberate. Or we take the weekend for ourselves. No emergencies, no expectations. Just see what happens. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until it escaped in a quiet rush. Outside, the wind curled against the windows, and somewhere deep inside the mountains, the first threads of fate pulled tighter. The city lights shimmered like 1,000 watchful eyes as the Sterling family yacht drifted on the harbor. The vessel itself was a floating palace, polished teak decks, velvet-lined lounges, glass panels that reflected the glow of the skyline. Victoria had been summoned under the guise of politics, Margaret's voice on the phone assuring her that Senator Williams would be present to discuss crucial healthcare legislation. It was the perfect lure, a cause Victoria cared deeply about, wrapped in the trappings of duty she could never ignore. She arrived in a sapphire silk gown that caught the lantern light like liquid midnight. Every step across the gangway felt deliberate, her heels clicking with the rhythm of inevitability. Inside the salon, champagne chilled in silver buckets, a string quartet played soft notes, and the air was tinged with the faint perfume of roses. It was flawless, almost too flawless, and instinctively, she sensed the staging of one of her aunt's performances. 20 minutes later, James appeared at the top of the gangway, and the sight of him stole the breath from her chest. He wore a tailored dark suit that transformed him. No longer the nurse awkward in a borrowed tux, but a man who belonged in any room, no matter how gilded. His eyes found her instantly, as though drawn by gravity, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then his expression softened with rueful recognition. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said when he reached her, his voice pitched low, as if the chandeliers themselves might gossip. "Po." "Neither did I," she admitted. "My aunt said Senator Williams wanted to meet me." "She told me a donor wanted to meet me," he replied. "I guess we've been played." Margaret emerged then, silver gown glimmering, eyes sparkling with triumph. "Oh, how wonderful you're both here," she declared, waving an elegant hand as if unveiling a masterpiece. "Now we can begin." "Begin what?" Victoria asked, suspicion tightening her spine. "What other guests?" James added, glancing around the eerily empty deck. Margaret blinked, feigning innocence with the precision of an actress. "Other guests? How silly of me. I must have gotten my weekends confused. It's just us, my dears. Dinner is waiting upstairs." With that, she floated away, leaving them staring at a table set for two beneath strings of lanterns and a canopy of stars. The setting was romantic enough to disarm the most hardened skeptic, and Victoria's exasperation battled with the undeniable thrill of being alone with him in this dreamscape her aunt had engineered. They sat across from each other, candlelight flickering between them, plates of delicate seafood served by silent staff who vanished as quickly as they appeared. At first, they danced around safe topics: books, travel, the children at the hospital, but gradually the conversation deepened, drawn out by the intimacy of the setting and the vulnerability that came with too much quiet. "What's it like?" James asked finally, being Victoria Sterling. She froze, fork suspended in the air. Most people only wanted to know how much she was worth, what deals she was making, or how she planned to wield her power. No one asked that. "Lonely," she said at last, surprising herself with the bluntness of the word. She set the fork down, her eyes fixed on the harbor lights. "Success is isolating. People either want something from me or they're afraid of me, or they assume I'm some cold, calculating machine because I have to make impossible decisions. Sometimes I don't even know if I remember who I really am." James didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I see someone who walks into a pediatric ward when no one's watching, who funds research not for tax breaks, but because she can't stand to see children suffer. I see someone who's been carrying other people's expectations for so long she's forgotten what she wants for herself." Her throat tightened. How did he see her so clearly when others only saw the Sterling name? "And you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "What's it like being James Harrison?" He let out a dry laugh. "Exhausting. Beautiful. Worth it. I never became a doctor because I realized what mattered most wasn't prescribing cures. It was being there in the dark, holding a child's hand, making them laugh even when everything hurts. That's who I am. Just someone trying to make the worst moments a little less terrible." Silence stretched between them, charged, vulnerable. Victoria's hand trembled on the table, and without thinking, James reached across, his rough palm covering her slender fingers. "Victoria," he began, his voice hushed but fierce. "I need you to know something before I lose my nerve. I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me." Her pulse hammered in her throat. The words hung like fragile glass between them, ready to shatter. "You're falling in love with me?" she whispered. "Completely, hopelessly, and I know it's insane. We've only had fragments of time together, but those moments have felt more real than anything else in my life." Her breath caught. The city blurred beyond the deck lights, the only clarity the warmth of his hand and the truth spilling from his lips. "It's not insane," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "Because I'm falling in love with you too." James stood, the motion sudden, pulling her up with him. The world narrowed to the space between them, and when his lips found hers, it was not tentative but urgent, the kind of kiss born from weeks of restraint breaking apart. Her hands curled into his suit, his arms encircled her, and everything Margaret had schemed, everything she had orchestrated, collapsed into this one undeniable truth. Unseen on the lower deck, Margaret watched from the shadows, her phone in hand. Her smile was wet with tears, and yet, even in her triumph, her eyes carried a secret, one she had hidden for decades, one that could still unravel everything. The ballroom at Sterling Technologies headquarters was transformed into a corporate battlefield. Rows of chairs filled with shareholders, reporters, and board members faced the grand mahogany podium where Victoria Sterling stood. She wore her Navy power suit-like armor, her hair swept back, every detail calculated to project confidence. The numbers had been extraordinary this year. Record-breaking profits, new acquisitions, expanded influence. By all accounts, she should have been untouchable. Yet beneath her polished surface, a storm gathered. One that had less to do with spreadsheets and more to do with a man sitting quietly in the second row. James Harrison looked out of place here, even more than he had at the gala months before. The nurse's scrubs he wore daily had been traded for a suit, but his eyes carried the same humility that had first undone her. He shifted in his chair under the scrutiny of hundreds, fidgeting with the cufflinks Margaret had given him as though they might shackle him in place. He hadn't asked to be thrust into this spotlight, but Victoria had insisted, and Margaret had orchestrated. The meeting had gone smoothly until the very end. Victoria concluded her report with her usual measured cadence, then paused, scanning the audience. The silence thickened. She inhaled. "Before we close today, I'd like to share something personal." A ripple of whispers swept the room. Sterling shareholders were used to announcements about mergers or expansions, not the private life of their CEO. Margaret, perched regally in the front row, leaned forward with anticipation, her sapphire necklace catching the light. "6 months ago," Victoria continued, "my aunt introduced me to someone who has changed the way I see the world. He is not a shareholder, he does not control millions, but he does something far more important. He saves children's lives. Please welcome James Harrison." The room broke into scattered applause as James, reluctant but steady, rose and walked to the podium. Every camera followed him, every eye dissected the cut of his suit, the modest watch on his wrist, the faint nervousness in his posture. Victoria reached for his hand. "I am pleased to announce our engagement," she said, her voice clear, decisive. "And the launch of the Sterling Harrison Foundation, dedicated to improving pediatric healthcare and supporting the doctors and nurses who give so much of themselves every day." The applause was louder this time, but laced with undertones. Surprise, skepticism, even disapproval from the Chicorso. Back, a voice called, sharp as a blade. "Is this wise, Ms. Sterling? To mix business with personal affairs, to bind the company's legacy to a nurse?" The word landed like a slap. James stiffened. Another voice followed, colder. "Shareholders expect continuity, stability. Can this man provide that, or will he tarnish what you've built?" The murmurs swelled, feeding on each other. Cameras flashed like gunfire. James felt exposed, his chest tightening with shame he thought he had buried years ago. He didn't belong here. He didn't belong at her side. He saw the board members' disapproving faces, the veiled smirks, the whispered word that sliced deepest, gold digger. He tried to withdraw his hand from Victoria's, but she gripped tighter, her nails pressing crescents into his skin. Her green eyes blazed, her voice sharp as glass. "Enough. This man has more integrity than anyone in this room. He doesn't build profit margins. He builds hope. He doesn't chase headlines. He comforts dying children. If you cannot see the value in that, perhaps you don't deserve to sit on this board." A stunned silence followed. No one had ever heard Victoria Sterling speak with such raw fury, such defiance. But James could barely hear over the roar of his own thoughts. He turned to her, his voice low enough only she could hear. "I can't do this." They'll destroy you. They'll destroy us. Her grip tightened. Don't you dare walk away from me. Don't you dare make me fight alone again. Her words trembled with more than anger. They trembled with fear, fear of losing him. Across the room, Margaret Sterling rose slowly, her cane tapping once against the marble floor, though she hardly needed it. Her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who had anticipated this storm and prepared her counterstrike. She lifted her hand and an aide appeared, carrying a slim dossier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret announced, her voice commanding silence without effort, "I have something to share." All eyes swung to her as she placed the dossier on the podium. The pages within contained a secret she had guarded for decades, one she had unearthed and polished into a weapon. "My niece's choice is not reckless," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It is destiny, and if any of you doubt his worth, perhaps you should learn who James Harrison truly is." Her words carried a charge, a promise of revelation that hung like thunderclouds over the gathering. Victoria's breath hitched. James's blood ran cold. What had Margaret done? And in that instant, before the folder was opened, before the truth spilled, their world hung on the edge of a knife, every future balanced on Margaret Sterling's lips. The applause from the shareholder meeting still echoed in Victoria's ears hours after the crowd had dispersed. Reporters swarmed the exits, questions fired like bullets, flashes stinging her eyes. James stayed close at her side, though she could feel the storm raging within him. Margaret had silenced the skeptics with that cryptic dossier, waved like a talisman, but she had not opened it. She had promised proof, validation of James's worth, and yet she had chosen suspense over revelation, leaving everyone, Victoria most of all, dangling on a cliff's edge. By the end of the week, whispers had spread through the city like wildfire. What did Margaret know? What truth bound the nurse to the empire? Some said James had noble lineage, others muttered about an inheritance hidden away. The speculation fed the tabloids, but no answers came. Victoria cornered her aunt in the penthouse one evening, demanding clarity. Margaret only sipped her brandy and smiled with maddening calm. "The right truth must be told at the right moment, dear. Timing is everything in life and love." It was 2 weeks later, at the dedication ceremony of the new pediatric center, that fate intervened. The entire city elite gathered again, this time not in ballrooms of marble but beneath banners emblazoned with the Sterling Harrison Foundation's name. Children in hospital gowns cut ribbons with golden scissors, their laughter carrying through the crowd like bells. For a while, joy drowned out doubt. Victoria stood proudly at the podium, her hand brushing her abdomen, where a secret of her own stirred. James clapped with the staff, his eyes shining with pride. And Margaret, radiant in powder blue, pearls glowing at her throat, looked more queen than matriarch, until she faltered. Mid-speech, as she recounted the first time she visited the pediatric ward, Margaret's voice broke. She pressed a hand to her chest, staggered, and the microphone screeched with feedback as gasps rose from the audience. In an instant, James vaulted the stage, his instincts taking over. He lowered her gently to the floor, 2 fingers pressed against her pulse, his voice calm but urgent. "Call 911, now." The crowd erupted into chaos. Victoria knelt beside them, her face pale, her aunt's hand trembling in hers. Margaret's eyes fluttered open as paramedics pushed through. Her gaze locked on James. A wry smile tugged at her lips, even as pain etched deep lines across her face. "You saved me," she whispered. "Just like him." "Don't talk," James urged, his voice thick. But Margaret tightened her grip on his sleeve with surprising strength. "Listen to me. I meddle because I lost my chance. I loved a man once, a nurse, like you. My father forbade it. I obeyed. I married wealth. I buried love. I swore Victoria would never make my mistake." Tears welled in her eyes, glittering like the sapphires at her throat. "Promise me, both of you, that you will never let go." Then she pulled something from her handbag, a sealed envelope, edges worn as though touched many times. She pressed it into Victoria's hands. "The truth is inside. Don't hate me for it." At the hospital later, Margaret lay pale against crisp sheets, machines monitoring her fragile rhythm. Victoria sat in the corner clutching the letter, her fingers shaking. James dozed in a chair, exhaustion and worry painted on his face. The envelope burned against her palm, heavy with all it might contain. She imagined every possibility, illicit deals, hidden scandals, secrets that could topple everything she and James were building. At dawn, Margaret stirred. Her eyes opened, and for a moment she looked at them with something softer than mischief, something closer to surrender. "Read it when you're ready," she murmured. "But remember, truth can cut or heal depending on how it's held." Then she slept again, leaving them in silence broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. Victoria's chest tightened as she looked at James. He stirred, catching her gaze, his brow furrowed. "What's in it?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever it is, it changes everything." The envelope trembled between them, a fragile bridge to a revelation that could shatter the foundation of their love or cement it forever. Outside, the city woke unaware. But inside that stark white room, the fate of their future and the meaning of Margaret's meddling rested in a single sealed truth. The night was quiet in the Sterling penthouse, too quiet for Victoria Sterling's restless thoughts. She sat at the grand mahogany desk that once belonged to her father, the lights of the city flickering beneath her like restless stars. In her hands, the envelope her aunt had pressed on her burned heavier than steel. It was creased, the seal brittle, as if it had waited decades for this moment. James stood by the window, his reflection haloed in the glass, arms folded across his chest. He hadn't asked again what was inside. His silence was trust, and yet it was also fear. Victoria's fingers trembled as she slid the letter opener beneath the flap. Paper whispered against paper as she unfolded the pages. Margaret's handwriting was elegant but unsteady, the loops of ink carrying both authority and age. The words leapt out, sharp as confessions, heavy as sins. "My dearest Victoria," it began. "If you are reading this, then the time has come to know the truth. I meddled in your life not merely because I wished you happiness, but because in James Harrison, I saw an echo of what I once lost. Years ago, before your father built Sterling Technologies into what it is today, I loved a man named William Harrison. He was a nurse, compassionate, brilliant, and unshakably kind. He was the one I wanted, but the Sterling name demanded a match of wealth, not love. My father forbade it. I obeyed. I lived the rest of my life watching the light drain out of something I never should have abandoned." Victoria's breath caught. Her eyes darted to James, who hadn't moved but was gripping the window ledge so tightly the tendons in his hands stood out like ropes. "William Harrison was James's grandfather," the letter continued. "When I met James at the hospital, it was as if the years folded and fate returned to offer me a second chance. Through you. I saw in him the same gentleness, the same fire, the same calling to heal. I knew he was meant for you, not because I was playing God, but because destiny had circled back, demanding to be set right. You were my chance to mend what I broke. Forgive me if I forced your hand. I could not bear to let you repeat my mistake." The words blurred through Victoria's tears. She lowered the letter, her pulse hammering in her throat. James had turned away from the window, his face pale but composed, though his eyes burned with something raw, shock, grief, and a strange recognition that bordered on awe. "So it's true," he whispered. Your aunt. She loved my grandfather." Victoria rose, crossing the room to him. The city lights painted them both in fragments of gold and shadow. "She saw in you what she lost," she said softly, "and she gave us what she never had." James laughed, but it was a hollow, broken sound. "So we're not just some chance meeting at a gala. We're, what, a second act to a story that ended too soon? Or the continuation," Victoria countered, her voice steady. "The story fate refused to let die." He shook his head, struggling. "Do you realize what this means? To everyone else, it'll look like a manipulation, that your aunt set this up, not love. They'll say I was a project, a way to ease her guilt." "Then let them say it," Victoria snapped, fiercer than she intended. "They've been saying worse since the beginning, but I know what's real. I know what we've built, outside of Margaret, outside of schemes, outside of anyone else's expectations. Do you doubt that?" The silence that followed was unbearable, every second stretching like glass about to crack. James stared at her, the stone arm in his eyes fighting against the truth she was forcing him to face. Then slowly, he lifted his hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "No," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I don't doubt us. I never did." Their kiss this time was not tentative, not stolen, but desperate. Two lives colliding with the weight of generations pressing down on them. The letter slipped from her fingers, falling to the floor, forgotten for the moment, while above them, Margaret Sterling herself stood in the doorway. Pale but upright, dressed in a silk robe, she leaned on her cane with the composure of a queen who had planned the endgame all along. "I told you," she said, her voice raspy but resolute. "Perfect bone structure, shared values, and now, unfinished history mended." Her eyes misted, though her smile held that familiar wicked gleam. "You see, my dears, Sometimes love doesn't begin or end, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it returns, determined to finish what it started. Neither Victoria nor James spoke, their arms still around each other, the truth heavy between them but no longer unbearable. They understood now what Margaret had risked, why she had meddled, why she had pushed so ruthlessly. She had not been playing a game. She had been fighting time itself. And for the first time, both Victoria and James realized that what they carried was not a burden, but a legacy. The cameras would circle, the whispers would rise, the empire would test them. But in that moment, wrapped in the city's glow and the weight of Margaret's confession, they knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were not just the heirs of fortune, they were the heirs of a love story fate refused to let die.